Okay, all right. Well, welcome everyone. Sorry it's a little bit late starting. One or two technical difficulties, not with the tech team, but with the vicar. So apologies we're a little bit late starting, but thank you very much for doing so. Thank you for being here, those of you who are physically here. We're going to look at part 2 of this journey with the Turin Shroud this evening. And I'll explain a little bit more about what we're going to do in a moment. But it's just great that people are engaging with this, are thinking about this. If you have joined us tonight online, or you watch this episode and you haven't seen part 1, then if you have time, that would be really good to look at, because I won't be able to go back over all of that tonight, obviously. Yeah, at the same time, if you're joining tonight for the first time, then it does stand alone as well. So, yeah, it'll all become clear in a moment. Shall we just begin with a little prayer? Well, Lord Jesus, as we come to look at the second of these talks about this particular piece of cloth, we do so because we want to know more about you, whether it is actually genuinely your burial cloth and resurrection cloth, or whether it's an image that somebody created to help people understand what you went through. Either way, help us to focus on you. Thank you that our faith and our belief in who you are doesn't rely simply on artifacts, but actually is based on Scripture and based on the knowledge of knowing you. But as we do spend time together tonight, we ask that you do help us to try and weigh up all the different parts of the evidence and everything like that, so that we can come to our own understanding and also gain insight into all that you have gone through for the love of us and for the world. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. I'm going to put my pointy stick down. I've been given a pointy stick, everyone, which I might use at certain points, but if I hold on to that, I'm going to use it like a walking stick, and I'll be sort of waving it around all the time. So, yeah, thank you again, as I say, for joining us. Where we got to last time was we looked particularly at the history of the Turin Shroud. Can you put the next one up for us, please, George, if that's okay? And we really began, after a general introduction, a little bit about the Turin Shroud. We looked at what we knew was the starting point of the Turin Shroud as we know it today. We have very clear dating of this Turin Shroud, this piece of cloth, from 1355 onwards, through France to Italy and to the Savoy family. I wonder whether it's related to the Savoy Hotel in London. Somebody might be able to work that one out. You sort of think it might be. They were the royal family of Italy, and it was placed eventually in Turin, and it only really moved from Turin during the Second World War because Hitler was really after it. So then it returned to Turin, where it's been ever since. So we've got a very clear understanding of its dating from 1355. We then, last time we met, looked at the history of the shroud. Could it be traced back before that date because of the carbon dating that was done, which we'll come on to in a moment. And what we found was, if you could press the next one for us, George, if that's okay. We went through lots and lots of different chapters, if you remember, those of you who are here. Do you remember we went through Constantinople in 1200? We went through back to a place called Antioch and Edessa, really dating back to the 6th and 7th century. We looked at the person of Justinian, who was the Byzantine emperor in the 700s, and how he minted a coin. But really we got back almost certainly to a very famous painting called Christ the Pantocrator at St. Catherine's Monastery in Sinai. And those who've been able to take the image on the Turin Shroud and overlay it with the image from this particular painting, I put them side by side here, have found there's over 150 points of congruence, which is really, you're into the 98, 99% match of these two incredible pieces of art. So they really do need to come from the same painting, which sort of raises all sorts of questions, or same image, which raises all sorts of questions. So that's really where we got to. We actually then, there is speculative evidence, which of course people will need to weigh up, that traces it all the way back even to the letters of Paul. But we're almost definitely sure that these two images in some way were connected back in the 500s. And of course that raises the whole issue of the authenticity and dating of the carbon dating. Yes, do you remember that? We looked at a little bit about that last time. We'll need to look at it again tonight, but coming at it from a different point of view. Okay, that's a very quick whistle-stop tour of where we got to last time. What are we going to look at together tonight? If you could press the next one for us, George. Well, one of the big things that I mentioned last time in the introduction about why many people have sort of made their mind up already about the Turin Shroud, not just in the church but in the wider community, is because of the long-standing understanding of the carbon dating from 1988 that dated the Turin Shroud to somewhere between 1260 and 1390, and the worldwide headlines that were made at the time, and that sort of still carries on in some ways for some people, as we'll come on to see in a moment. But in the light of that evidence, what we're going to look at tonight is to look at the Turin Shroud from a totally different point of view. Not so much in terms of trying to trace its history as a historical and piece of art that was used very powerfully within Christianity over the centuries, but from a more of a forensic and scientific point of view tonight. Can you put the next one up for us, George? And really, this story of the forensic side of things and the scientific side of things really starts in 1898 with a gentleman called Secondo Pia, because he took the first photograph of the Turin Shroud. This is where my stick will come in handy, everybody. Oh, so this is a sort of I've tried to find an image that is roughly the colour of the Turin Shroud as best as I can find it. So the yellow of the Turin Shroud is this, and can you make out an image on it just about? But it's very faint, isn't it? We'll come on to why it's very faint in a moment. When Secondo Pia took the photograph, of course they were using those big plates in old-fashioned cameras, and he is renowned as saying that he virtually dropped the plate, which would have been really awkward, but he virtually dropped the plate when he took it into the dark room and actually came out with this image, because what was dark in the shroud became light in the image, and suddenly it was like this image came to the fore, and that had never been seen before, ever. And it took his breath away. And it's been this image that has mystified scientists and Christians and the wider world, really, ever since. It's probably the most studied piece of historical artifact, more than Tutankhamun's head mask, more than the pyramids, more than absolutely anything from history. This image has been studied more than almost anything else. So we're going to look at it a bit more together tonight, but that's really when it started, the turn of the 1900s. Next one, please, George. In 1978, there was a big investigation and study of the Turin Shroud from a scientific point of view. It's really been the most comprehensive, the most full understanding or examination of the Turin Shroud that's actually been carried out. I've just listed some of the many different tests that were put up there. I don't know whether you can see that at home and here, but I'm not going to read them all out to you. Some of them I had to look up as to what they actually were. But you've got infrared stuff, you've got X-ray stuff. Thermography is to try and check out whether it was made by burning, because one argument was how could the image be made? Could it be made by scorching? And so they needed to look into that. Ultraviolet stuff, lots of photographies, raking light photography, come back to that in a bit later, and then microphotography. And so they had 5 days, they worked completely round the clock for 120 hours non-stop, just gathering as much evidence as they possibly could. And then they took it away for the next 3 years and they worked on it. Next one, please, George. Oh, I've got them in the wrong. Go on to the other major thing. Sorry, in 1988, you're quite right, George, it was 1988. Can you go back one? Just to do a chronology, 1978 was the big study. 1988 then, what was this carbon dating? Didn't they do carbon dating at the time of the big study? Some people wonder why they didn't do carbon dating at the big time. The reason is because in 1978, you had to take a sample. I've got a microphone in my hand, but like this big. And by 1988, you could take a sample this big. You know, like telephones, mobile phones, have gone from telephones this big. I know it sounds really weird, Lewis. Lewis, who's coming up 13, has never seen probably a mobile phone this big. And of course, these days we can get them to do incredibly powerful things. So it's the same sort of thing. Science really advanced. In 1978, the people who were the custodians wouldn't allow it to be used. 1988, they did. And these samples were taken. Next one, please, George. And then lastly, just to complete sort of a timeline, in 2002, there was something called the Shroud Preservation Project, and they built a special box for it to stay in, which even has argon gas in it to protect the image on the shroud. It's also bomb-proof, bulletproof, because sadly over the years, 1 or 2 people have tried to destroy it. So, yeah, that's where it's at the moment. It's in that box, and it will be there. And it's only ever taken out of the box when they put it on show, which is probably once. I think they did put it on show earlier this year, at the end of the pandemic. At Easter, as part of trying to encourage people. Next one. So this is, I'm sorry to put up a lot of text, but it's quite important before we start, just to get a feel for what that big scientific study said. So sorry if there's lots of words, but some of it will come back later on. We're not going to be able to take all the detail, but I just want you to particularly hear the last sentence. The scientific consensus after 3 years of study, and indeed 2 years of study before they went, is that the image was produced by something which resulted in oxidation, dehydration, and conjugation of the, I can't say the next word, polysaccharide structure. And I've put of the top 2 microfibrils, we'll come back to that later, of the linen itself. The rest of it was untouched. That's why it's a very faint image. There are no chemical or physical methods known which can account for the totality of the image. I've underlined totality to mean they can create bits, but they can't do the whole thing. Either they can't do the whole thing because it's very complex, or because they can't do the whole cloth. So either in complexity or in size. Nor any combination of physical, chemical, biological, or medical circumstances explain the image adequately. And then this is the point I wanted to make. Thus, they concluded, the answer to the question of how the image was produced, or what produced the image, remains now, as has in the past, a mystery. So that's where they got to. After all that study and everything else, using the most up-to-date equipment they possibly had, stuff that they were using on Apollo space missions and goodness knows what else. They got to the point where they said, we don't know how it was done. Next one, please. I'm going to refer throughout the next part of the talk to something called the Da Vinci Hypothesis. And you're going to say, what in the world's that? Of all the alternatives for how the shroud can be created, the closest alternative to the idea it was a mystery, and we'll look into what the mystery means in a minute, is this Da Vinci hypothesis. So I just need to explain a little bit about what it is. Leonardo da Vinci, I've put a date for him around about 1490. It was when he was doing quite a bit of his work. And what the argument goes is something like this. Leonardo da Vinci was an incredible mind, an incredible artist, and he was also somebody who wanted to challenge the church. He was a nonconformist. He didn't like being part of the church. He wanted to do it his way. And he actually did two things. He studied the human anatomy, but probably to the same level, if not greater, than many surgeons of his day. Without getting too grotesque, and we're going to have to do some fairly gross stuff tonight, he actually used to take bodies from the mortuary and he's dissected them with his scalpel to actually work out how the human body worked so that he could draw the perfect human being. So he dissected muscles, he dissected all sorts of organs, etc. This is a painting of his skull, or a picture he drew of his skull, of what a skull would look like. So he peeled back all the flesh and everything like that. So he was really into understanding the anatomy. This is important to the argument. So he would know how a crucifixion worked. This is how the argument goes. The second thing is that he was very into lenses, like glass lenses, but he was using them to also create all sorts of images. And the argument goes that he, well before photography was invented 300 years later, he used the lens against a sheet, and the sunlight was what the image. Do you see what I mean? So he hung a body outside, put it through a lens in a dark space, put silver nitrate on the sheet and left it for a few days, and somebody's replicated his experiment, and this is what they got, which is the image you can see there. Obviously it's upside down. Do you see what I mean? They didn't do an actual person, they used a plaster cast model. Does this make sense? Sort of? Because the argument is it can produce a 3D image on the cloth. So on the one hand, you've got an understanding of crucifixion. On the other hand, you've got the ability to create an image that is a 3D image. We'll come back to why that's important in a bit. For those who want to hold on to this particular form of argument, the Da Vinci hypothesis, the main strengths of it from their point of view is that it maintains the carbon dating of the cloth. So you don't have to change the carbon dating of the cloth. Da Vinci used an old cloth, 100 years old. The image was later, but the cloth was dated from that period. And then secondly, it provides a very natural explanation of how the image was formed. All right? That's the argument. And so what they're saying, the title of the book, written by a lady called Lynn Pickett, is How Leonardo da Vinci Fooled History. All right? This is the idea that he was trying to subvert the church. He was paid by the Savoy family a huge amount of money. The reason there's no account of his writing about it was And also, there's no account of him discovering photography, but which is really awkward, because if you think he'd actually discovered photography, he would have actually other example of anybody, let alone Leonardo da Vinci, ever doing any photography. So you're saying he actually was able to do something, didn't tell anyone about it, and then it was buried again for 300 years before Secondo Pia took that photograph. All right? That's the argument. What I'll do is I will, as I go through, I will just raise this from time to time. The reason being, I want you to weigh up the evidence. When we met last time, if you remember, we talked about there is no absolute proof about all this stuff. We know quite a lot of science, but we have to all take that science and weigh it up in our minds as to what we think actually took place. Just as if you were in a court of law and you were a member of the jury, or you were the coroner in a coroner's court. But the closest other alternative, the shroud does not have any paint on it, apart from in one corner. So it wasn't painted. So people who talk about the shroud being painted, Leonardo da Vinci painting it, it doesn't work like that. There's no brush strokes, there's no pigment, there's no chemicals. The cloth is not fused together. The only thing that fuses the cloth fibres together is blood. There's no other chemical, no other whatever. And of course that includes silver nitrate. So how did he get rid of the silver nitrate? But it's another matter. Do you see what I mean? It just, for people who say, well, somebody painted it, with the greatest of respect, they probably haven't looked at very much of the evidence. So people need to come up with a much more creative alternative if they're going to say that it was a medieval forgery. And as I say, Da Vinci is probably the closest to that, as I best see it. Next one, please, George. We need to crack on, otherwise we're going to be a very long time. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through quite a bit of scientific evidence. And at this point, I'm going to hold my hand up. And I hope I'm not going to upset you all too much. I've spent quite a long time on this, and I've only got through the forensic stuff tonight. If you really would like me to, I'm happy to put the time in. I will do the scientific stuff for another talk. But I think we're going to use the rest of our time tonight easily just going through the forensic stuff, and I'm going to have to go much faster even to do that. But just to get your head around all this, as best as we can see it, there are two images on this piece of shroud, this piece of linen. There's an image that is to do with a crucifixion, so the death of someone, so I've called it the burial cloth. And then there's an image which I've entitled the resurrection cloth. But they're two separate images, all right? Because otherwise we're going to get confused, all right? So one's the burial cloth, one's the resurrection cloth. What we do know for certain is that they had to be created at different times. And we know that the blood cloth, the cloth with all the forensics of the crucifixion, had to be created first, because the blood stains, the image of the actual person of Jesus, or the person in the shroud, doesn't carry on through where the blood is. So the blood had to come first, and then the image of the resurrection, if you like, or the image of the shroud, actually had to come second, and where the blood is, it didn't take. So it's very interesting, because normally if you were going to do a piece of art, you would draw the outline first, and then you would fill it in, wouldn't you? So it's the other way round. All right? And we know that has to be how it was created. So where it says Da Vinci Hypothesis, if Da Vinci did this, he had to go put somebody through a crucifixion and do that side of it, and then later create the photographic image on the same piece of cloth. Okay, next one please, George. And we're going to look at mainly the forensic stuff tonight. So, just to get us into a bit more of a scientific understanding of things, from the image that you can see before you, which is the Secondo Pier image of 1898, from lots of other evidence we know around the place, we can know for certain that the hair and beard of the image of the person in the shroud is consistent with that of a first century Jewish rabbi. I'll show you a little bit more about that later. Do you notice, where's my stick? Do you notice under the chin there, it's rather square, yes? It's almost like he's had a bigger beard but sort of cut it off, yeah? That's because one of the customs in that time was to put sort of a band underneath the jaw to hold the mouth up, because the idea was that you needed to stop the spirit leaving the body in a way that was not appropriate. So a way of sort of holding the person together and keeping them holy was to hold the jaw up, and you tied a cloth around, a strip around there, and held the jaw up. And that's why his beard is sort of tucked under that. Does that make sense? Behind the thing holding his jaw up. I'm going to have to go a bit faster than this, but the posture is exactly the same as many of the burial people we found, not victims, but the burial people we found at Qumran, which is where the Dead Sea Scrolls are. The piece of linen cloth is exactly the same as many other burial cloths in Jewish custom. And then the other thing is the body has not been washed. Normally, if somebody had died at home naturally, they would have been washed and then spices would have been applied. But we know from other records that in first century trauma victims, the body was not washed. And that's what's happened in the shroud. So it's interesting, isn't it? Just little bits of evidence before we actually move on to the more sort of gruesome stuff, which is what Lewis is interested in. Next one, please. So let's start with one of the most more difficult scenes, if you like. Let's look at the whole issue to do with flogging. What we know from the picture at the bottom is all these marks here, which is the back of the person. They match exactly what a flogging would have looked like with something called a Roman flagrum, which is this instrument up here. It was a stick with leather straps on it, and then it had dumbbell lead weights at the end of it, usually 2 or 3. And it would have been across the back or other parts of the body. They match exactly. I've tried to find a picture here which you can even see can you see the 2 ends of the dumbbell there? Yeah? Sort of? Probably just looks like a stick, but actually it's you can see the 2 balls of the dumbbell. Anyway, the body has been struck something like 370 times. And because of the level of forensic science we have now, we know that it was done by 2 people, and one was taller than the other. So they would have stood Jesus would have been probably not on the floor like this. He would have been strung up at head height, and his arms would have been attached like that around a chain or a post, because there's no marks on the back of the arms, so they probably were higher. And he was then flogged pretty much within an inch of his life. Why was he... This is different than all other crucifixions. And why that was so was normally you would have had about 20 or 30 lashes, because the idea was that you were going to be crucified on a cross as a demonstration of the power of Rome. So they didn't want you to be too poorly before you actually were put on the cross. Sorry to be a bit gross about this. So why is this body got so many more? And one answer is that Pilate was actually trying to save Jesus. If you notice, he does try to save Jesus by raising up Barabbas and trying to sort of get the crowd to support Jesus rather than Barabbas, and let Jesus go. So the argument, or one argument, is that he said, well, give this guy a really good flogging and perhaps the crowd will change their minds. So that's why Jesus was flogged more than anybody else. And of course, those of you who know your Old Testament will know from Isaiah chapter 53 that it was going to be by his stripes that we are healed. But it just gives you an idea how many stripes there actually are. And we can see that from all the evidence here on the back, and you can look elsewhere, on the legs, and on the front. Next one, please, George. This was so violent that normally when you cut yourself, people at home won't necessarily know Lewis, but Lewis, you know when you cut yourself, usually the blood goes dark, in a cut after a couple of hours, and then it scabs over and stuff. When somebody goes through very acute trauma, like in the First World War or in a war situation or whatever, the body actually tries to survive at its most basic level by producing a different chemical called bilirubin. And it's to keep the oxygen in the body, to try and help the vital organs to stay alive. The thing about bilirubin is it doesn't change colour. And one of the things about the Turin Shroud, I tried to put it up here, doesn't look very bright red to you, but actually it's bright red in comparison to blood 2,000 years old. And it was this very point that the main photographer, when we looked at all that list of different sorts of photography, it took Barry Schwartz 17 years of thinking about this. And that it's what, he was the person who was actually holding the shroud day in, day out for 5 days. He came to the conclusion it had to be the authentic cloth because he discovered it was bilirubin. He was saying it's too bright, it's too red. It can't be genuine. It's got to be some sort of weird paint somehow. But actually, when he found out that chemically from a medical scientist that it was this particular form of blood, then he decided and believed that it was the genuine cloth, which is really awkward because he's quite a devout Jewish person. People who worked on the shroud weren't necessarily Christians. They were the very best in their field at that point in time in the late 1970s, mainly from America, but also from Italy. But it gives you an idea that not only was Jesus flogged, but actually he was flogged to such a point where the body, the only way it could react at a human level was to produce this bilirubin. Next one, please, George. We then come on to the cross. Now, normally when we see a picture of somebody, maybe on Good Friday, we carry a cross, which is obviously cross-shaped and everything else. The reality is we now are 98% sure that it wasn't a physical cross like we see often in films or whatever. It would have been just the cross beam. And what you see here, can you see these bright marks here? Yeah? Either side of the shoulders? What's happened is that the beam has rubbed the wounds to produce, they've opened the wounds even more and produced more blood. That's why it's light, because remember it would have been dark on the original cloth from the blood. So we know that it was something called a patibulum, and it would have weighed something like 40 kilograms. How much do you weigh, Lewis? Do you know? Yeah? So it would have been like me putting you and a bit more across my shoulders and carrying that. And what happened was that at this point, your arms would have been tied to the cross, and your legs would have been fastened fore and aft with the person before you and the person after you. So what happens is if one of you trip, you've got your arms out. Can't really do this very well. You've got your arms out like this with this beam across your back, and it's much heavier. You're also flogged within an inch of your life. And if you trip over, there's not going to be anything to help you stop falling. And what we know is that Jesus, or the person in the shroud, has a broken nose. We know the person has taken the skin off their knee, or their left knee, and they have a bruise under their right eye. Now, the bruise under the right eye may have been caused by falling, or it may have been caused by a soldier giving him a good thumping. Next one, please, George. Let's come on to the wounds of the crucifixion. We looked at this a bit last time, but just to remind ourselves, in art of the Middle Ages, unfortunately, but the nail is always put in all pieces of art through the palm of the hand, about there. But what's happened in this is that we can see by where the blood comes out, here's the blood here, that the wound, actually, the nail was driven through. Oh, it's really hard trying to do this, but driven through there, if that makes sense, and it would have come out here. Thank you, Kirsty. So it would have come out here, yes? You sort of see it in that picture. Too small, really, but you can sort of see it there. Thank you very much. When you did that, do you remember we talked last time about it would have severed the tendon in the thumb? And you can see here, there are the 4 fingers, but no thumb. And what we know also is that the nail marks, the wound marks, are exactly the right size for Roman nails that we found. The Roman nails are about 7 inches long, with a head about 1 inch. So it's not a small little nail that you get from B&Q. Next one, please. And just to finish off, people who know about these things, forensic scientists, coroners and stuff, when they've looked at this, they know that the person... Where's my friend Kirsty? Here she comes. The person in that image, because of the way the wounds have opened up and the way the blood has worked, the person was in order to survive, you were being held like that, at roughly about 20 degrees above your horizontal plane. As that meant your chest started to cave in, you pushed up with your hands and your feet, even though that was held by nails, to try and survive, to get a breath. And so you basically wore away the wound in your hand, and that matches exactly with what's in the shroud. And so the thing that I find quite, I'm not saying nobody said this, but I sort of find quite difficult to get your head around. If this was a piece of art that was created by somebody, not only did they have to know all this, the reality was the person had to be alive when they did it. So it had to be a live crucifixion. There's no other way of doing it. So it wasn't that they got a dead corpse that was absolutely perfect and then did some really grotesque stuff to make it into the image for the shroud. It had to be a live person who went through a physical crucifixion. That's the only way of doing it. So we'll move on from there. Next one, please. Oh, have we missed one? I thought we had feet. No? That one. And then, okay, I've lost feet somewhere. Never mind. Sorry, I'll put the feet back in for those of you who would like to see the feet stuff. Basically, the same wounds are on the feet. Sorry, I've lost that one somehow. What happened was, normally, can you go back one more just a minute, George, if that's all right, back to can you see how the feet here are side by side? Yeah? They're side by side. What we know is that the same nail was driven through the left foot over the right foot. So the feet were put together, and the single nail, which was 7 inches long, was driven through the foot, both feet. And we know that because of the amount of blood that's collected on the base of the right foot, as obviously the person was dying. Sorry, next one please, George. I don't know what I've done with that slide. Let's come on to the spear wound in the side. Hopefully this isn't too gross for people. What we know is that the size of the wound from the spear, we found Roman spears. There's quite a few Roman spears, but the size of the wound matches exactly the size of the spear. And also the angle at which it was pushed at went between the 5th and 6th ribs. They knew exactly where to put it. Bear in mind, the people who were doing this were professional executioners. And if they didn't do it right, and the person survived, they would be executed. It was a very brutal world. So you were going to be absolutely doubly sure that the person you were killing actually was dead. And the angle of the wound is exactly consistent with somebody not being up on a cross like you see in many of the films, you know, Jesus of Nazareth, sort of him 20 foot up in the air. It would have been about a foot or so off the ground. And the spear would have been rammed in through between the 5th and 6th ribs. What we know is that the wound that was created was post-mortem. So that's different than all the other wounds, the flogging and the nails. There's no bilirubin there. In fact, what we know is that the wound, the fluid from the wound collected around the back of the body and the hollow of the back when they were laid down in the cloth. And that's been analysed, and it comes from the sac around the heart. So when it says in John's Gospel, blood and water flowed out of his side, that's exactly what happened. Strange, isn't it? So somebody would have had to have gone to all these lengths to actually have decided that this was how they wanted to do it. The last thing is, most crucifixion victims that we found, they've all had their legs broken. It was the common practice to speed death. After they'd humiliated them, they broke their legs because then they couldn't push up to get the breath. Oops, sorry. Got everything in my hands here. They couldn't push up breath, so they suffocated. But the bones on the shroud, the man in the shroud, have not been broken. So that's a lot of evidence. I hope I haven't overdone it too much with you, but that's some of the more sort of gross stuff of what actually would have actually happened. Next one, please, George. This particular image is about, do you remember we looked last time at something called the Sudarium of Oviedo, the head cloth? And just to remind people that the scientists have compared these two famous pieces of linen. They match the same, they can't match the blood exactly because there's not enough DNA to do that now. But the two headcloths match both the blood type and the shape of the blood stains. I've put an image up at the bottom here somebody trying to show where the images are on the face of in the shroud, and the shape of those blood stains matches exactly that on the headcloth. So people like forensic scientists and coroners who've looked at all this are again 95 to 98% sure that they come from the same person, from the same incident, and also there's other evidence to do with pollen grains and dirt samples that both match each other and match Jerusalem. And of course, for those of you who know John's Gospel, you'll remember that it says in the John's Gospel that the headcloth is put to the side in the tomb, along with the body and wrapped in the shroud. But to give you an idea, what would have happened when somebody died was that the cloth would have been wrapped around the head. Again, do you remember what we said about the jaw not letting out a person's soul, if you like, too quickly? And so that's why the head was wrapped in that particular way. Now the difficulty is, from the point of view of a forgery, and indeed from the carbon dating, is that we have a clear history of the sudarium, the headcloth of Oviedo, from 614 AD. So it's very difficult to it means that Da Vinci, if he was to do this, had to have gone to Oviedo in Spain to actually see the headcloth and then matched it completely in order to make this possible. Otherwise it doesn't make any sense. Next one, please, George. We're getting there. We've got a few more to go, but we're getting there. I mentioned about the pollen grains. They were really taken by a gentleman called Max Fry. Thanks, Kirsty. A gentleman called Max Fry, who took these special tape samples. He took it from all over the cloth, not just the head. But of all the samples, they are clearly from, the majority are from Jerusalem. Others are from Syria, Constantinople, Europe. The crown of thorns that would have been placed around Jesus' head actually comes from a plant. It's called, oh gosh, is anybody any good at these things? Gundilia something or other. Toriforni. I wish Rosemary Bailey was here. She'd be able to help us out. But it's a plant that has lots of leaves, but then within it, huge spines, and also flowers and berries. And basically, what they're pretty sure happened, the soldiers didn't sit there knitting together a crown of thorns. I'm sorry if that ruins any images for you. They grabbed one of these plants that they saw was so acutely painful, and they just grabbed it and rammed it on his head like a helmet. What's interesting is, these days, when you've got the level of microscopes and electronic microscopes, etc., they've actually seen and found these pollen grains down here. And what we know is that that particular plant on that head had to flower between March and May. And when was the crucifixion? April. So it means, if you're going to follow the Da Vinci argument, Da Vinci also had, as well as going to Spain, he had to get somebody to go all the way to Jerusalem, because there's plants are only found in Jerusalem or in the Mediterranean region around Jerusalem. It's not just Jerusalem, but it had to have somebody go all the way out to Israel or Syria, Israel, get a plant at that particular time of year, bring it back and shove it on the head of the person while they were alive. Next one, please. What we can see, you see, can you see these bright marks here? That's partly the blood, but also it's the flowers. So it wasn't just like often we have a crown of thorns made up of like brambles. It would be like having your brambles with the flowers mixed with the berries and the leaves. Does that give you a better image? And it was rammed on his head. What we can see is that the blood comes all the way around both parts of the head. Have any of you had something called neuralgia? I get it quite a lot, usually when I'm tired or whatever. And it's like all the nerves in your head are you can't touch your head. Give me a nod. You ever had that? I think they call it a head cold or something like that. Imagine that like 100 times. What happened was these spines are so long they would have invaded the central nervous system, and that would have sent the person almost certainly into sort of semi-comatose state. It's quite incredible how the person in the shroud even survived. Just the helmet, let alone all the flogging and everything else. What's interesting, for those of you who like a bit of something a bit different, can you see this little bit here? A very strange white V. Can you see that at all? There's a strange, can you see, if I point it with that, you can see a V sort of shape there. Jewish rabbis, and as a Nazarene as well, Jesus would never have cut his hair. And it would have been basically rolled up like a ponytail, made into a ponytail and then rolled up. It makes him sound like a bit of a hippie, doesn't it? But that's how it would have been. What's interesting is the person in the shroud had hair that came down like a first century rabbi who would never have cut their hair. So the level of detail is absolutely incredible, really. Next one, please. So I'm going to bring stuff about the body to a close, because we've been going nearly an hour. We know from all the other stuff that the body is in rigor mortis. The definition on the back of the legs and the knees, and much other evidence too, including even the swollen stomach, shows the body was in rigor mortis. And yet it had not started putrefaction. I've put petrification. It should have a U in there somewhere. The physical body after you die, it starts to leak, basically. And that hadn't started. So the body had to be in the shroud somewhere between 2 to 3 days, or 2 and 4 days. 60 to 72 hours. That's the only time this could have actually been formed. The person has to be a living person who was crucified. There's really no other alternative once you start getting to this level of forensic science. Any other way of creating it. And as I mentioned earlier, the blood is AB blood, which, do you remember we looked at that? It's unique to Jerusalem. Well, it's not unique, but it's very, very rare outside of Jerusalem, and it's about 20% of Israeli people. The dirt samples that have been taken from the left knee, from the nose, and from the feet all go to something called travertine aragonite, which is a unique limestone to Jerusalem. And then the bit that really gets me, there's no sign of any fight or flight in the shroud. Victim. He hasn't fought to get away. He hasn't tried to leave the cross in any way. He hasn't got what they call the death mask. When you see images of people who were killed in the Holocaust or in fires or First World War or whatever, they've often got a very frightened face. This is not a frightened face. It's not haunting in a negative sense. I find it incredible to see this face. Next one, please. Let's look at the linen cloth that he was wrapped in. We looked at this a bit last time. It's made of a 3-in-1 herringbone weave. Those of you who remember us talking about that. The raking light photography was actually to photograph the cloth side on, not front on or back on, but side on, because they were sure there was a cloth like this would hold a memory, and they know where all the folds were, and the folds are exactly where they ought to be. Not only for it to be folded up to be put in a cabinet, but so that it could be displayed and everything like that, like as we looked at last time. All the folds are there. So if this was a forgery, somebody had to know not only how to look after it in a cabinet, say, or a box, but how to also fold it in the right places so that it would also create the memory for it to be displayed in the way that it was throughout art. And it's all there. The actual cloth itself can only be really dated to one place and one point in history, which is between Syria and Egypt in the 1st century. There's no record of any cloth ever being made like this in medieval Europe. The cloth is 14'3" by 3'7", which is 8 Syrian cubits by 2 Syrian cubits. An exact match. It's very, very expensive. And really, the only other people who would have been buried in a cloth like this were members of the Sanhedrin, the 70 of the ruling council of Jerusalem. It was either used for priests or it was used for kings. It was that level of expense. To give you an idea, people have worked out, in John's Gospel it talks about him being wrapped in spices before his burial. People have worked out what 100 pounds of spices would have cost, round about £20,000. So most people say, John's Gospel, it talks about this being the burial. The cloth was bought by Joseph of Arimathea. It may well have been, as well as building his own tomb and using that for Jesus' burial, it would not be a surprise that if he's got his own tomb ready, he's also got his own cloth ready for him to go into, and he simply goes and gets that and uses his own cloth that he was going to be buried in, which would have been for the Sanhedrin, because he was a member of the Sanhedrin. And then Nicodemus splashes the cash big time and goes and gets all these spices. It just gives you a level of the love and the desire to show dignity to this person, when most other crucifixion victims were either left to die on a cross or they were thrown in a pit. There's only really 2 or 3 records of people being buried in tombs, family tombs. But this person in this shroud had to be buried that way, because all the evidence is there. Next one. Last one. Nearly done. Done ever so well. Can you see? I don't know whether you can see it actually. There's a very, very faint line along the top here. Can you see that? Not really. This is one of a strip of linen. So the cloth was folded over the head and down the back. If you're lying down, it was folded underneath you, your body was put on it. The cloth was folded over endways. But then it was tied. It was tied around the neck, and it was tied around the feet, and possibly tied around the waist as well. The piece of cloth that has been sewed back on to the Turin shroud matches that exactly. And the way that cloth is tied on, is re-sewn back on, it has a particularly unique form of stitching used, and the only other place there's any record of that sort of stitching being used is at Masada between 40 BC and 73 AD. So if you're looking for where that was, somebody had to know how to sew in that way, because it's not like any more medieval European stitching. So again, somebody would have had to have gone all the way to that and to those lengths, or hit upon it purely by chance to actually have done it. That's as far as I got. But we'll just say goodbye to everyone, and then we'll have a few questions. I hope I haven't bombarded you too much, but it's just given you a little bit of... I've actually left quite a bit out just to get the bare facts across. But it gives, for me, just to conclude for tonight, and then we'll say goodbye to everyone who might join us online, is it gives me an insight into that face. Are you able to go back to that face for a moment, George? Back a couple of slides, just the one before the... That's it, one more. Yeah, thank you. If this is the person of Jesus in this cloth, the love that that person must have had for the world is incredible. Absolutely incredible. To have gone through, when scientists have looked at this, forensic scientists, coroners and people who deal with all sorts of horrible stuff in big major cities like New York and stuff, they say this is the most disfigured body, most abused body they have ever come across. And yet, to see the love in the face, not the death mask, is, I find, quite, I don't understand, apart from to wonder and be amazed. So we will have another go at doing the image next time. But we'll sign off for tonight and say thank you ever so much for joining us. That's about an hour, isn't it, by the time people have done it? So it's about the same time as last time. I hope it's not too much for everybody, but thank you ever so much. We will post when we're going to do the last one, which is to look at the image in the shroud, because that's just as fascinating in another way. But we'll say goodbye for tonight, and thank you for joining us. Bye, everybody. Oh, it's just going to go bub. Is that okay? Bye, everyone.